welcome back. This is the final section on Cosmovisions and the Mayan and the Popol Vuh. And in this section, we're going to be talking about the Popol Vuh dualities and how that reflects on or describes the universe, the world around the Maya people. So I mentioned at the end of the historical context, I mentioned the rise of two dominant Maya city-states, I suppose you could call them, the Quiché in the south and Mayapan in the north. As I said, both cities dominate these respective regions through conquest, and they receive tribute from the dominated neighbours. Both cities have, or rooted in their power bases, networks of Maya and Nawa families. Now, there's something you might notice about the rise of the Quiché and Mayapan that's reflected in the Popol Vuh. And it's something that's there from the very beginning and continues throughout the book. Now, we've talked about cycles, which in the Popol Vuh, in fact, aren't really portrayed as destruction and rebirth. But in the they use the or the way Ted Locke translates it is sowing and dawning. So things seeds are sown in the earth, and then they dawn. They when they sprout. There's something else other than these cycles that's always there in the Popol Vuh, and that's reflected in the rise of Quiché and Mayapan, and that is dualities, twins. So even in the very terms sowing and dawning, that's a duality. Twins are there all the way through. You've got Spiakok, the dawn,
Smukane,
sunset. You've got the hero twins, 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu. Then the next generation of hero twins, Hunahpu and Spalanque. And you have their enemies, Sipakna, volcano, and his brother Kabrakan, earthquake. So anyway, these are just some of the dualities that you can see in the Popol Vuh. And this is reflected in the Mayan reality. So you've got Quiché and Mayapan, the establishment of a city in the north and another in the south. In the Popol Vuh, it recounts the history of an earlier classical period when the two cities were Tulan, the western city, and
Tulan Zuyua,
the eastern city. Now, by Tulan, the western city, is most likely they're referring to the great central Mexican sacred city of Teotihuacan, which I mentioned in part the beginning of the historical context, and
Tulan Zuyua
is most likely Caminal Juyu. So why am I emphasizing this? Well, really it's to underline that these dualities underpin Mayan existence. They're part of the cycles of sowing and dawning, which in itself is a duality. And what's also important to note is that these dualities are eternal. So they predate the existence of the sun, because in fact the majority of the narrative is about the time before the dawning of the sun. And essentially, the rebirth of one of the hero twins, Hunahpu, is the dawning of the sun, and his brother Spalanque is reborn as the moon. But the majority of the narrative takes place before then. And another point to mention is that these dualities form part of the cyclical nature of time. So those who manage to get through the text, you'll notice the prominence of the Mayan ball game. Both sets of hero twins play out on the ball court, which it's also important to note is the cemetery. And because of the noise they make, they're summoned before the lords of Xibalba. Xibalba is the land of the dead, it's the underworld. And both sets of hero twins, they journey to Xibalba. And when the first set are contending with the lords of Xibalba in the underworld, and then they're sacrificed, they actually lose. Their children are playing ball on earth. and we'll talk about that more in the class. But that's something to look out for. And essentially, the Popol Vuh is tied into everyday life. In itself, it's an epic story. It is an epic origin myth of the time before the sun. Yet, as it provides very precise information as to when to plant, when to harvest, when the rains come, etc., etc. But you might ask, well, how? Well, as an example, the text mentions 400 boys. These are the gods of alcohol, and they try to take on the monster Sipakna, the volcano. Now, they're defeated by Sipakna. He's too strong for them. He kills them, and they're scattered into the sky as the constellation Mots, or as we know it in Europe, it's the Pleiades. And this is a constellation that's visible at only certain times of the year. It falls below the horizon in the west, and this corresponds to the time of the slaying of the 400 boys by Sipakna. Now, the Pleiades, or Mots, also maps onto a symbolic representation of a handful of seeds. And so when the Pleiades disappears below the horizon in the west, or when Mots disappears below the horizon in the west, more to the point, then the Maya know that it's time to plant. Another mini story within the larger narrative of the Popol Vuh is the defeat of the fake sun, Seven Makor. And he's defeated by the hero twins, the boys, Hunahpu and Spalanque. And they're told to do this by the sky god Hurricane, who gets annoyed with Seven Makor for his presumptuousness, his pride in pretending that he's the sun. And the defeat of Seven Makor signals the start of the hurricane season. So in the narrative, what happens is he's shot from his tree by one of the boys, and he falls to earth. And this brings on the flood that destroys the wooden people. Wooden people are the humans that were created before the people of maize, who are the current Maya. And in the sky map, Seven Makor corresponds to the constellation we know as the Plough, and that descends towards the horizon. When it descends towards the horizon at nightfall in mid-July, this signals the onset of the hurricane season. In mid-October, it climbs back into the sky, or, in other words, Vukubkakis, or Seven Makor, climbs back up its tree, and the hurricane season comes to an end, more or less. Yeah. So the important thing to bear in mind is that the entire narrative corresponds to a sky map and to the movements of celestial bodies, so constellations, stars, and also the planets. And really importantly, in particular, to the movements of the planet Venus, because that was the sun before the sun. And it's these cyclical movements that the Maya used to measure time in a really complex way. Now, the final point I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the real climax of the book, which is the dawning of the sun, is of such importance because despite the fact that the Mayans are dispersed through the region and are extremely diverse people, this is the one moment that unified them in a way that they'd never been unified before or since. So, just to quote it, it says, "There were countless peoples, but there was just one dawn for all the tribes." And Tedlock discusses this, and he says that what makes this vision of unity possible is the possession of a common 260-day calendar based on the movements of the sky and common to all the Mesoamerican peoples. So, the Nahua peoples as well use this same calendar. These are the people of maize, the people that were made from maize. Remember that also from the Popol Vuh, that the peoples that were created before the people of maize, in particular the people of wood, they're unable to keep the rhythms of time, and they forgot to venerate the gods. in due course. They didn't use the calendar, and this seriously annoyed the gods, and so they sent Cataclysm to destroy them. So yeah, is there a moral to the story? Well, make sure your timekeeping's pretty good, or the gods will destroy you.
So if we were going to sum up the key points of these three sort of short podcasts, the first thing to mention is what we mean by a cosmovision. Cosmovision, it is the way people understand the universe, the way they interact with the universe, the way they visualize it, the way they experience it. And that includes not just the material universe, but also the spiritual, non-material entities as well. Indigenous American cosmovisions are exemplified by two things in particular. And those two things are very, very prominent in the Mayan sacred text, or the sacred narrative, the Popol Vuh. Those two things are, firstly, the cyclical nature of time, the fact that life gives way to death, and death is necessary for life to begin. Or you can also describe it in terms of destruction and rebirth, or as the Popol Vuh does, in terms of sowing and dawning. But also within that, there are always dualities, recognizable dualities, male, female. In the Popol Vuh, you've got the twins, you've got in Mayan cities, dominant cities, you've got the Quiche and you've got Mayapan, or in the earlier period, you've got Teotihuacan, you've got Caminal-Juyu. So always dualities. And that's reflected in the material reality as well as the metaphysical cosmovision. So yeah, those three things. What is a cosmovision? It is the way people interact with the universe around them and all the entities within that universe. The cyclical nature of time is absolutely key. And finally, that time and space are structured by dualities. And that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much.